Prison is considered to be a safe and secure place from which it's very difficult to escape. But many people do manage to do it, and some have done it several times. From the British man who made 5 escapes to the daredevil who escaped from prison by helicopter. This is Infinity, and in this episode I'll show you people that no prison can hold. Let's go. Moondyne Joe. Let's start with the man who could be called the leader of escapes. No prison could really hold him. Moondyne Joe was a British outlaw and also the most famous bushranger, the name given to criminals hiding out in undeveloped Australian territories. In 1848, he was sentenced to 10 years for stealing groceries and was sent to Western Australia to serve his sentence. A few years later, Joe was released on parole, but then was arrested again, this time for stealing a horse. While Joe was serving his time, there was a wave of escapes through the prison, but Joe showed good behavior and after a while was released. He was imprisoned again for killing a neighbor's bull, but he managed to escape with another prisoner. A month later, they caught him again, but Moondyne escaped again. Throwing off his chains, he met up with the other fugitives and devised a plan to get them together to the settlements in southern Australia. They walked about 180 miles through arid, undeveloped territory before a squad of police officers caught up with him. When Joe was jailed again, the warden told him he would forgive the sentence if he managed to escape again. Sure enough, he succeeded again. When he was caught again, they first put him in the cell, but the new warden found out about his predecessor's promise and thought it would be unfair to keep the chronic fugitive behind bars any longer. Joe spent the rest of his life, more or less, well, only occasionally committing petty crimes. Jack Shepherd. The full namesake of the main character from the Lost TV series was also a British criminal. Like Joe Moondyne, Jack Shepherd went down in history because of his ability to escape from custody. He managed to do it as many as 4 times. In his youth, Jack began to engage in theft and burglary. He was arrested and imprisoned 5 times in 1724, but he managed to escape 4 times, continuing his crimes after each escape. His escapes made him a well-known figure in the community and made him very popular with the poor. The first time Jack escaped from prison through the ceiling scaffolding and down a rope made of sheets. The second time, Jack escaped in a similar fashion but with his accomplice. The third time, Shepherd escaped from the visiting room, and the fourth time he made an epic escape through the chapel and the roof of the prison. After the last escape, Jack wasn't free for long. He was arrested again, and on the 5th time, he couldn't avoid the gallows. Richard Lee McNair. In 1987, he raided a granary in North Dakota, which was not without victims. Richard was arrested, but only a few hours later, he was free. He deftly managed to free himself from the handcuffs and get out of jail. However, he was soon caught and still sent to a correctional facility. 5 years later, he escaped with 2 accomplices, after which he spent about a year on the run until he was arrested again. Although the third time McNair was placed in a secure prison from which it was almost impossible to escape. He managed to fool everyone. He staged an escape by mailing himself in. Sounds strange, but it was. Richard constructed a box with a breathing tube, hid in it, and sent himself to a warehouse outside the prison. Waiting for a moment, McNair cut the box open, got out, took off his prison uniform, and ran away. He could have been caught the same day. The police officer spotted McNair as the outlaw ran across the railroad tracks. By some miracle, the fugitive managed to convince the officer that he was not a criminal and that he was not at all the person the police were looking for. McNair soon moved to Canada, where he hid for about a year and a half. Still, justice was delivered to the trickster. Eventually, he was caught and incarcerated at ADX Florence for life. This prison is considered the most secure on the planet, so it's unlikely McNair will be able to escape. Escaping from prison by mailing yourself and convincing the officer that you're not a fugitive is very daring and epic. Perhaps only one other person could match McNair in this respect, and that's Pascal Payette. In the late 90s, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison for murder committed during the robbery of a security van. Of course, he didn't serve 30 years. After only a couple of years behind bars, he decided to escape. How do you think he did it? Maybe he talked the guards into it? Or did he come down from his cell on sheets like Jack Shepherd? Neither. Pascal escaped from prison in Louisiana by helicopter. It seems like something that only happens in movies, but the reality is just as amazing. That's amazing in itself, but it's far from over. Pascal was soon caught and imprisoned again, but in 2003 he escaped again and again used a helicopter. A couple of years later, it was all over again. Arrest, imprisonment, several years of waiting, and an escape by helicopter. Even just 3 escapes from prison is something incredible, but escapes by helicopter? This happens only once in history. By the way, Payette was caught after all, and now he's serving a sentence. There were no more helicopters, but the guards should keep a close eye on the sky. What if another helicopter shows up? Willie Sutton. Because that's where the money is, was Willie Sutton's answer to journalists when asked why he robbed banks. Willie went down in history as the American Robin Hood. He was different from other robbers. He never took a loaded gun on a job for fear of hurting someone, and he never killed a human in his life. All the more surprising is that throughout his criminal career, he'd robbed more than 100 banks and stolen about $2 million. In 1947, he made his most famous escape when he and several accomplices stole guard uniforms and made mock pistols out of wood. When Sutton, who was climbing over the wall, was caught in the spotlight, he shouted, "It's all right," and quietly walked away. No one even tried to detain him. In February 1952, the fugitive was put behind bars again, and in 1969 he was released for good behavior. Sutton spent the rest of his life advising banks on burglar-proofing systems. Despite his rather peaceful disposition, Sutton enjoyed enormous authority among the prisoners who were even afraid of him. The same can be said of some other criminals, only unlike the American Robin Hood, they're far more dangerous. Keep watching to see the most dangerous, formidable, and reckless inmates no one would want to share a cell with. Let's start with one of the most famous criminals of all time. Surely you've heard of Charles Bronson. He's a famous personality about whom films are even made. Tom Hardy starred in one of those. The movie's called Bronson. Charles is often called the most dangerous prisoner in Great Britain and even the world. In 1974, he robbed a post office and stole only a couple of dozen pounds. Bronson was sentenced to 7 years, but is still in the prison, serving already a life sentence, all because of his insane character. Bronson was a big fan of fighting. He assaulted guards and other inmates dozens of times. For this reason, he spent most of his time in solitary confinement, so he couldn't hurt other inmates. Bronson also took his own lawyer, a teacher, and Iraqi prisoners hostage, and ordered them to call the general. Bronson also tortured himself and made very strange demands to the wardens. This is unequivocally the craziest prisoner at the moment. Hardly anyone wants to deal with him. All the more surprising is that at the same time, Bronson donates to medical experiments and Christmas lunches for pensioners, and also makes art and draws pictures. Charles Bronson is still behind bars, but the next man in this episode has long been on the loose, and that's frightening, because this is a real serial killer, both on the outside and within the walls of prisons. Brazilian Pedro Rodrigues Filho, nicknamed Perino Matador, embarked on a path of criminality at an early age. At 14, he killed the vice mayor of the city for having fired his father, a school security guard who stole groceries. There was more. By the time he was 18, he had 7 victims and 16 attempts on his conscience. Later, his father, whose honor he had previously defended in a brutal way by taking revenge on the vice mayor, was added to the list of victims. In 1973, Pedro was arrested and placed in prison, where he only continued to gain momentum. About 50 people became his victim behind bars, and as it turned out, Matador's motive was to cleanse the world of criminals. The fact that he had everything wrong with his head became obvious thanks to the expertise. Pedro was recognized as a psychopath and paranoid. With dozens of ruined lives on his conscience, Matador should have been in prison for the rest of his life. But in 2018, he was released. Now, once the world's ferocious prisoner, lives his life as if nothing had happened. He shares stories and even attends podcasts. Curtis Algier. Curtis Algier went from minor offenses such as reckless driving and petty theft to more serious and heinous crimes, including robbery, carrying a gun, and so on. Over the years, he was jailed and released on parole, but that ended in 2007. The prisoner was then sentenced to 9 years in prison, but he didn't even last a couple of weeks. Algier complained that he wasn't feeling well, and when he was sent to the doctors, he managed to attack the guard and grab his gun. The incident became fatal. Algier went on the run but was caught very quickly. Now the dangerous prisoner is guarded, and guards will do it for a long time. The criminal received a well-deserved life sentence. Some prisoners can be so dangerous and inadequate that all contacts with the outside world and people are almost completely restricted to them. Such was the case with Thomas Silverstein. He went to prison in 1971 for armed robbery. 4 years later, he was released on parole, but soon he was back in prison for another robbery. This time the sentence was 15 years, but Thomas made things worse. While in prison, he killed a guard as well as 2 cellmates. The court deemed Thomas incorrigible, changed his sentence to life in prison, and transferred him to solitary confinement at ADX Florence, the same maximum security prisoner where Richard Lee McNair, the master escapee, now serves his sentence. For 36 years, Silverstein lived in total solitude. He spent 23 hours a day in his cell, leaving each day for an hour's walk in another cell. By some miracle, he didn't go insane, and in 2019, the criminal was gone. That's all, guys. Who do you think is the most dangerous criminal of all time? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and see you later.